Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddell. I'm the director here. Welcome to the latest in our Big Thinkers series. I'm delighted to welcome David Runciman, who's a professor of political science at Cambridge. I read David's book when it came out at the end of last year, and I mentioned it to one of my colleagues who attended your lectures, David, and I noticed there are a number of people in the audience who attended your lectures. However, fortunately, your thinking has moved on since they attended the lectures, which is a few years ago now. David will be talking about the challenges to democracy and how they're overcome, and the compromises involved in that in this book, some copies outside for afterwards. Jesse Norman, the Conservative MP and author of a book on Edmund Burke, will be responding. Jesse is a variety of talents, which he's going to be displaying this evening, because he's going on from here to a charity entertainment event at the Palace of Westminster, when he'll be playing in a band. So this is part of the varied life of an MP. Unfortunately, no musical accompaniment this evening. But I thought it would be very interesting to have David setting out his ideas and then being involved in a conversation with Jesse, because many of the ideas about Burke actually touch very much on some of the thoughts that David had looking at democracy. In this book, he discusses various episodes, very interestingly chosen, but I'll let David to fully explain that, going back really to de Tocqueville and his reflections on democracy in America and how he came to them, and how actually de Tocqueville changed his various views, which is fascinating. And then going on to a number of episodes coming up to the most recent one, most recent financial crisis, some of the aftermath on that. I won't go further into that because I don't want to take more of his time, but David's going to talk for about 20 minutes, then we'll have a response from Jesse, and then I'll be moderating a conversation, and I hope we'll have time at the end for some questions from the audience. David.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this. So what I'll do in my 20 minutes, I'll just say a little bit about the questions that provoked me to write this book, say a little bit about Tocqueville, who is, in a sense, my hero in this story. I don't talk about Burke, but maybe we will. And then say a little bit about how I think some of these ideas apply to politics now, even some of the ways in which I've slightly changed my mind since I wrote the book and since it came out. The questions that the book is motivated by are questions about the relationship between democracy and crisis. And I started thinking about it and researching the book in 2008, right at the heart of the financial crisis. And I was struck then, I've been struck since, by the range of different things that are going on in a democracy during a crisis, but also during a period of crisis talk. And one of the striking features is that there really isn't any time in a democracy where there isn't some crisis talk. It's completely ubiquitous. The word is promiscuously used. Politicians bandy it around. Newspapers bandy it around. Intellectuals bandy it around. Academics bandy it around. I look at 100 years of democracy in this book. I look at what politicians have said, what commentators have said about democratic crises. And I found, in looking back over the past 10 decades, that they're all crisis of democracy decades, even the ones that we don't think of as being particularly bad or dangerous. I mean, not just the obvious ones like the 1930s and the 1970s, but even the ones that we think of as being better than those ones, like the 1920s and the 1960s. I can find you a crisis of democracy literature for almost, not every year, but certainly for every decade, and in some decades for every year. And often it's the academics who are the ones who are most hysterical. So there's a kind of hysterical inflation of crisis language that surrounds scandals, government mishaps, elections, just routine events. But then there are also real crises. So in 2008, there was a lot of hysterical crisis talk, some of it apocalyptic, you'll remember. The world was going to end, the West was going to fall apart, democracy was finished. But there was also a real crisis going on, a very serious moment in the history of modern democracy, a crisis, as I understand it, which is a moment of potential rupture. And in the book, I'm talking about established democracies. I'm not talking about fragile democracies that might fluctuate between military rule and elections. I'm talking about democracies like this one, Britain, that is, not the Institute. I don't know. Established democracies do face serious crises, and in the book I look at a series of them. So there's a lot of crisis talk. There are repeated real crises. And then there's also the evidence of the last 100 years that democracies tend to survive them, that they are remarkably durable, that actually even in 2008 there was this very serious crisis, but it was taking place against a backdrop of a solid success story, essentially the Fukuyama story, which extended through into the 21st century, that democracies had risen, the established democracies, the Western democracies, but then spread more widely around the world, had risen to the challenge that all of the challenges the 20th century had to throw at them. And so in the middle of the 2008 crisis, I found it, and this is just as a citizen, not as someone trying to write a book about it, very hard to know how to take the crisis talk. Is it inflated? Is it real? How bad is it? At what point does the apocalyptic language actually become something that you should take seriously? Was the crisis of 2008 really going to unravel a 100-year success story? Was democracy so successful and also so vulnerable? So you have these three things going on simultaneously: the hysteria, the kind of way in which democracies keep stumbling into these crises, the kind of inattention that they have. And it's often the case that there's a lot of crisis talk, but the actual crisis is not the one that people were anticipating. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone, so in thinking about this talk and also some of the events in the book, I suddenly remembered, which I hadn't even remembered when I was writing the book, that I wrote an article in 2005, just before Blair's third election victory, in which I said the British democracy, the British state, is about to face a real crisis of legitimacy, because if Tony Blair wins this election on barely a third of the vote, on barely the half of voters turning out, maybe 1 in 5 people voting for him, and he still wins a significant majority in Parliament, people aren't going to put up with it. It just won't make sense. How can you have 1 in 5 people voting for a government that then has the powers that a majority government has under the British system? A crisis of legitimacy is coming for the British state. Well, it wasn't, and it didn't, but there was a crisis of liquidity coming, and ultimately a crisis for some institutions of solvency, and I had no idea that that was 2-3 years down the line. Of course, a few people saw it coming, but the crisis talk that preceded 2008, a lot of it missed the crisis. There's hysteria, there's inattention, failure to spot what's really happening, and there's durability. Democracies survive this. How do these three things go together? And in reading and thinking about this book, about halfway through the period when I was researching it, looking at the history of democratic crises over the last 100 years, but also looking at the history of political thought and what some of the great thinkers had to say about the question of democracy in crisis, I decided that the best answer was in the best book ever written about modern democracy, which is Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But I stumbled across it in a way. I wasn't looking for it there. But in rereading that book, I found what looked to me like an account of democracy that doesn't just explain how hysteria and inattention and durability go together, but how they have a similar cause. They come from the same root. And the root is the muddle of democratic life. The fact that democracy is a kind of muddled form of politics. It's often chaotic, it's confused, there's a lot of frenetic surface activity, it's divided by definition, parties divide it, classes divide it, it's often fractured. That feature of democratic life helps explain the hysteria, and Tocqueville, who travelled to America in 1831 as a young man, arrived there thinking that democracy probably didn't work, but eventually came to the conclusion that it did. He was struck by the mismatch between the surface hysteria, the prevalence of crisis talk, not just newspapers, but politicians, citizens being willing to talk up every little drama into a crisis, and the underlying stability, and that there was this permanent tension or mismatch in democratic life between a kind of frenetic surface activity and an underlying durability. That explained the way in which so many people in a democracy have an incentive to talk up crises, to the extent that people almost become immune to it. They're inured to it. It becomes part of the noise of democratic life. You read the Daily Mail describing something as a crisis and you do not believe it because you have read it one too many times before. Tocqueville noticed this in 1831 in America. Every election is described as a crisis. He has a chapter in Democracy in America called The Crisis of the Election, and crisis is a joke there. Every election is the one that's going to change everything, and none of them ever do. Underneath the surface, there is this stability. And that combination produces a kind of surface hysteria an underlying stability and often a complacency, an underlying sense that the crisis talk is just talk. It also produces a series of real crises. Because when you have crisis talk that no one believes, and then an underlying stability that people rely on, you get lots of mistakes. And Tocqueville said the striking thing about democracies is just how many mistakes they make. The muddle, the confusion of democratic life makes it really hard to focus on what's going on, to see it in time. He said democracy is always untimely, it's always late, it always misses it. There's too much noise, there's too much confusion, and then there's too much underlying complacency to tackle problems as they arise. Democracies make lots of mistakes, but they also correct lots of mistakes. Because that frenetic surface activity, coupled with the confidence that people have that democracy is durable over time, means that democracies don't get stuck with the mistakes they make. And that was his central insight. He said democracies make more mistakes and they correct more mistakes. And that's how they stumble into crises and they stumble out of them. And his argument was you can't have the stumbling out without the stumbling in, and you can't have the stumbling in without the stumbling out. It's the same cause. The reason democracies keep making mistakes is the same reason that they are able to correct them. And that was his central contrast with autocratic systems of government. He thought that autocrats were better in the short term at getting things done, but in the long run, they got stuck with the mistakes they make. And there are repeated examples of that, and we may be living through one now. I mean, Putin has shown how an autocratic regime can seize its moment. And there's also a reasonable chance that if that seizing of the moment is a mistake, he will be much less adept at wriggling his way out of that mistake than a democracy would, not least because a democracy would dump the leader when the leader made the mistake. So autocratic regimes, they get stuck with their mistakes, essentially because they're stuck with their leaders. And that framework seemed to me to be a way of understanding a persistent story that runs through my book through a series of crises. And I'll just give you one example because I don't want to take up too much time, which is the first example in the book, which is I look at a series of crisis years through this kind of framework, the muddling through, which means muddling in and muddling out. And as you muddle out, the next crisis is somewhere around the corner. And the cycles that I look at in the book are sort of 10 to 15-year cycles of crisis. The first crisis that I look at, the first crisis year is 1918. There's a lot of 1914 talk at the moment. How did we stumble into that mess? And I think this account probably could explain some of that. There was certainly a lot of hysteria and a lot of inattention in the summer of 1914. The real crisis was not the one that was on top of people's list. But I'm interested in what seems to me the real crisis year of the First World War, which is the final year of the First World War, which displays all of these features, and I'll just do a very paraphrased version of it. There was a lot of hysteria in 1918. There was a widespread sense which had been building up throughout the First World War among the Western democracies, and essentially here I'm talking about the United States, Britain and France, and the United States is now in the war, and Russia is now out. So it's a straight confrontation by 1918, essentially understood in the democracies. Democracy is now in a life or death struggle with German autocracy. And in the first half of 1918, there was a widespread and borderline hysterical sense in Paris, in London, in Washington, that democracy was not up to it. That democracy was a chaotic, confused form of government. It did not rise to the challenge of total war. That the German autocrats, Ludendorff particularly, Hindenburg, they had the decisiveness. They could marshal their forces. They knew how to seize the moment. And the democracies were too muddly. They were too untimely. The Americans had joined the war. Where were their troops? Where was their money? Wilson was pandering to Congress, as he always did. Wilson was pandering to Wall Street, as he always did. Wilson was worried about public opinion, as he always was. He was a democratic politician. He joined a war. He didn't have the wherewithal to fight it. The Germans were marching on Paris. The British and French line had broken. The war, if it wasn't about to be lost, was on the brink of being lost, and if it was going to be won, it would only be won in 1919, 1920, 1921. There was a sense that the chaos of democracy was undermining it. In fact, just as democracies miss the crises, they also often miss their great victories. To the surprise of almost everyone in the West, it turned out the moment of crisis was about to become the moment of victory. In 1918, almost from nowhere, to everyone's astonishment, the German state collapsed, and it was the democracies that marched through. The explanation, although of course it's a complicated story, but I think the explanation is essentially Tocqueville's explanation. The democracies were more adaptable. They made more mistakes during the First World War. Their sense that Ludendorff was able to marshal his resources in a different way was probably correct. But when Ludendorff made a mistake, he was stuck with it. The democracies were more adaptable. They were able to experiment with different ranges of decision-making, including with various forms of autocracy. One of the claims I make in the book is that democracies can experiment with autocracy because they are constantly chopping and changing. They don't get stuck with it, established democracies. Autocracies can't experiment with democracy because autocrats are terrified of opening the door to democratic chaos. Thanks to their adaptability, thanks to their flexibility, thanks to their experimental muddling quality, they muddled through to victory to their own astonishment. Then towards the end of 1918, as the victory becomes clear, the democracies in the West, including but not just in the United States, think this is their moment. This is their chance to seize the moment and create a world safe for democracy. But the trouble is, the thing that causes democracies to muddle their way through to victory is the same thing that causes them to squander their victories, which is they never sit still. They never seize the moment. Democracy is a confused and chaotic form of government. There are too many interests to reconcile. There are too many different sites of power. Public opinion is hard to marshal. It's too focused on the short term. Elections keep getting in the way. I tell the story at the end of the book about the elections in 1918, the midterms in America and then the general election in Britain. It really didn't help asking the voters what they thought, because the voters were interested in what we would call bread and butter issues. They were not interested in saving the world. They rarely are. The thing that caused democracy to muddle into victory caused it to squander the victory. You can't have the muddling through without the muddling, the muddling in without the muddling out, and the muddling out then sets the scene for the next crisis. The ways in which democracies squandered their victory in 1918-19 famously set the scene in due course through a complicated series of steps for the next crisis I talk about in the book, which is 1933. And so what I do in the book is I tell this series of repeated, almost cyclical patterns. Democracies are taken by surprise by real crises. The established democracies tend to adapt and find a way through. Of course, more fragile democracies fall apart. Weimar Germany didn't adapt. There is, as I say in the book, a kind of threshold here, which I call the confidence threshold. There has to be that underlying faith in democracy for the muddling through to work, because if there isn't, the muddle causes people to lose faith. But established democracies, the United States, Britain, eventually much of Western Europe, and then as I tell the story, it spreads to places like Israel, India, Japan, go through these cycles of being surprised by crises, finding a way out of these crises. So then the question is, and I'll just talk about this for 5 minutes, and then we'll discuss it. So what's the moral of that long story as I tell it through these cycles? And the final crisis that I talk about is 2008, which was the crisis that provoked me to start thinking about and writing the book. So now, what are we, 6 years on? There is a consoling story to be told here, which is that we muddled through. The apocalyptic talk in 2008 that Western democracy was on the brink of the abyss turns out not to be correct. And we did muddle our way through it. And when I say we, it depends who we're talking about here. It's a mixture now of technocrats and central bankers, but also politicians. Gordon Brown, in some sense, managed to muddle his way through. The European Union, the crisis then shifts to Europe. There's another wave of apocalyptic talk in 2010 at the height of the Euro crisis, coming from commentators but also from politicians. Sarkozy was saying that Europe was on the brink of falling back into the 1930s, back into the threat of European civil war. In retrospect, this looks like hysterical talk. Angela Merkel, who kept calm, looked like the person who knew what was going on. But again, no one would say, I think, that the solution, and it hasn't been solved yet, but the ability to survive the Euro crisis has been anything other than a case of muddling through. It's not been a case of Putin-like autocratic decisiveness. It's classic democratic muddling through, with a mix of democratic and technocratic institutions. But democracy still driving this process, the chaos of elections, changings of government, looking for solutions, improvising solutions. Maybe in Greece you wouldn't think that we've muddled through, but in Ireland I think you might start to think that the muddling through is going on. So maybe this is part of this cyclical pattern. But that's the optimistic story. Just at the moment where the academics, the intellectuals, the newspapers are saying the sky's falling in, that's the moment to bet on democracy. And that's a familiar story, it's often been told. Tocqueville didn't think that. So Tocqueville did not think this was a consoling story. I think, who knows what Tocqueville would think now, but I think he would think that the gloomy side of the story at present outweighs the optimistic side, and I'm with him on that. So I think what he thinks. I've decided what he would think. And I think it's because even in his analysis, right back at the beginning of the story, and after when he's writing about American democracy in 1831, that's really the only democracy there is. He's not a prophet because there aren't prophets, but he's very prescient. Right at the beginning of the story, he has a sense that there's a danger here, that this cycle creates all sorts of hazards, including moral hazards. The ultimate moral hazard being that democracies think they can get away with all of their mistakes. And the longer that this pattern repeats itself, it's not that what you get is a kind of accumulated historical wisdom. We learned how to survive this crisis, we have that knowledge, which is sometimes the story that's told. We survived in 2008 because we had learnt the lessons of the 1930s and the 1970s. The other story is that we keep stumbling into these potentially terrifying crises, like 2008, because we think we can stumble out of anything, because we're democracies. It's never as bad as it seems to be. The crisis talk is always hysteria. There is an underlying stability. And Tocqueville thought that that was a very dangerous thing for democracies to start to believe, but the chances are that over time, that would become more entrenched, not less entrenched. As it were, the gap between the hysteria and the underlying complacency would get bigger, it wouldn't close, because there would be lots and lots of crisis talk, and it would be increasingly discounted. So there is still a lot of crisis talk around. It's moved on from 2008, but this is democracy, so there is always a crisis. We are currently apparently living through a crisis of democracy. There is the cost of living crisis that is being talked up in fairly obviously pragmatic political ways by the Labour Party, but it may well be real too. It's certainly real for some individuals. But there's the broader sort of disenchantment with politics crisis, the Russell Brand crisis, for want of a better. The young people no longer care about politics. More broadly, voters, you can read, I certainly have read, I'm sure we've all read, if we read the newspapers, you can read articles which say people who do focus groups have noticed, even in the last couple of years, a kind of step change from people having dislike and distrust of politicians to just outright contempt. There is unquestionably a widespread disenchantment, and it's described as a crisis. But it's still so hard to know how seriously to take that term. I mean, is this just part of the inflated crisis talk of democratic life? And there do seem to me, the danger here is there seem to be a series of challenges, problems, threats for contemporary democracy that don't necessarily fit this pattern of cyclical stumbling in and stumbling out. The pattern I tell revolves around economic crises and wars, which tend to have their focal points, tend to have their moments at which there is a kind of coming together of the hysteria and the underlying stability to produce this kind of adaptability. The crisis talk meshes onto a series of important structural challenges that produce a kind of adaptable politics. It doesn't feel like we're at that yet, certainly in whatever the current crisis is, the cost of living crisis, the disengagement crisis. The Russell Brand's solution to it is to kind of pull back sufficiently that the state, he's with me, right? He thinks there will be a crisis of legitimacy if enough people stop voting and people just pull out of the system altogether. It seems very implausible to me. Crises of legitimacy are almost always in stable democracies part of the hysterical crisis talk. But as it were, the pulling back is not going to close the gap between the crisis talk and the kind of structural changes that might be needed. But then there are other, and I'll just finish with 2 points. There are other challenges that don't seem to fit this pattern at all, and I'll just flag up 2, because the time frames are different. And the danger of thinking that every 15 years democracies stumble into a crisis and stumble out of them is it believes that history works in cycles, and it doesn't. History does not repeat itself. I've told a cyclical story. I do not believe that this story is going to keep going forever. This time might be different. There's always the threat, the risk, the possibility that this time the crisis is different and the crisis talk is different. So one crisis that just doesn't seem to me to fit this pattern is the crisis of environmental threat and the failure of democratic politics to adapt, because the time frames look wrong. It doesn't seem to fit this pattern of every 10 or 15 years a kind of complacency builds up that produces a crisis that then challenges that complacency, which produces a muddled solution that allows a new complacency to build up. Because it may be that by failing to adapt in time, that is, by failing to adapt preemptively, by the time the crisis becomes real for us, the sorts of things that we would have needed to do to adapt will be too late. There's nothing in this story that suggests that where preemptive action is needed to forestall crisis, that Tocqueville account explains how democracies are going to do it. If anything, I think the opposite is true. And then the other one, which I've sort of become more aware of since writing the book and even since publishing it, is the threat of, or the challenge of technological change, which again doesn't seem to me to fit this pattern. In a sense, if the ecological challenge is the time lags are too long, the technological change, the change is too rapid. It's too hard to understand what's going on even as it's unfolding. I don't think anyone knows what, in 15 years' time, technology will have done to democratic politics. It's almost impossible to imagine. But that kind of potential step change does not fit this pattern. It doesn't fit, I think, the pattern of muddling through and muddling out. And features of the contemporary technological world, the world that we inhabit now, they look familiar. So just to take one final example, I mean, one feature of the tech world that is becoming increasingly clear is it's a world of monopolies. And we are now preying increasingly to corporate as well as state monopolies in the control of information, in the control of various services. Well, democracies have been through those crises before. The Gilded Age in the United States was an age of monopoly, and then Theodore Roosevelt came along and he trust-busted his way out of that mess with muddle and inadvertence, but he did it. And so now Ed Miliband is reading Doris Goodwin's book about Theodore Roosevelt to learn how it can be done. And without denigrating Ed Miliband, he is not Theodore Roosevelt, but kind of even if he were a sort of big game hunting maverick, why on earth would one think that the story from 100 years ago is the way to understand the monopolies that exist in a world, a networked world of social technology, which is transforming how we live on a monthly basis? And it might be that it is completely different. So the risk, and I think Tocqueville would think this is the risk. Tocqueville thought that the long story of democracy would be broadly a success story, but it would have this sort of worm running through it, which is the hidden risk, which is the success story becomes the problem. It becomes the source of the complacency. And over time, that complacency builds up. It doesn't dissipate. And one feature of the complacency is to believe that the history tells you the way out of these crises. And there must be a possibility that the crises that we currently face cannot be solved by reading a book like my one. And that, I'm not selling it, but that's in a way, I think, sort of the moral of the story, that it is a clear pattern, and the hazard, the moral hazard, is to believe in the pattern.
Thank you. Thank you. No, well, would you like to get up there?
If you wouldn't mind.
Okay, that's fine, Jesse. No, thank you very much indeed, David. Just before I introduce Jesse, I'm so glad you made that reference to Ed Miliband. I have thought it is the most absurd comparison imaginable. There's no two people less alike than Ed Miliband and Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt thought the Washington State was where you go shoot things, not where you get computers. And I'm very glad you brought that up. Lots of challenges there. Muddling through, muddling along, clear patterns, challenges which are outside the democracy, coming out of it on technology and environment. Jesse.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you all very much indeed. And most of all, thank you, David, for an absolutely cracking book. And I hope the first thing we'll do after you've finished our talk is to rush outside and load up with copies of this for yourselves and your families. Certainly, when I do events, I love it when people say that about my book, and I'm very thrilled to do it on your behalf for David. I'm going to keep my remarks short, not least so that the former students who are desperate to get one back on their tutor can have a chance to say a few words in the Q&A. I absolutely share David's veneration for Tocqueville. The only book you should read before you read this book is Democracy in America. And, of course, Tocqueville went to America originally, of course, to look at prisons, but actually went to see the future. And he comes out of that, as many have done since, thinking of America as the future. And I just want to kind of reflect a little bit on what that might mean. Of course, it's absolutely right that there has been a deficit in the public support for politics as we have it now and the public understanding of democracy. And you see that in the very limited ways in which people think about democracy. So they think about democracy very often as being just about what happens at the ballot box. Well, of course, that's a tiny fraction of an extraordinarily complex individual set of circumstances and arrangements that constitute the established democracies in the different places that David's talking about. And one of the ways in which one of the mistakes we make is to analogize the developing democracies to the established democracies as though that, as it were, there's a continuum, because in fact developing democracies in many ways are really rather different. The book is a wonderful book, not least because, as David described, this confidence trap is a cycle through which you can think about various different stages in our own history in various different countries. And it has a wonderful kind of Tocquevillian, Pascalian bivalence, where it turns out that everything you thought was good is actually the seeds of ultimate destruction. And vice versa, of course. I suppose if I was just going to pick up a couple of things, the first would have to do with what's really going on in the contrast between democracy and autocracy. So there's a thought that democracy is above all adaptable, and autocracy is very well brought out by David, able to solve problems in the shorter term because it has an apparent firmness of purpose that is lacking in democracies, where, as it were, the leadership and the system itself are always, or the exact configuration of the system are always in some sense up for grabs. And it's quite interesting to reflect that actually, if you think that that's the problem, then one of the things you worry about is what you might call the increasing rationalism of British politics. You know, the kind of belief that politics is reducible to economics, and economics is a science in some sense, and therefore we ought to be constantly measuring things on these utilitarian grounds. And actually, that's not only a deeply mistaken view, in my view, of politics, it's a deeply mistaken view of economics. It also leads to a thoroughly debased, culturally debased conception of human beings. And of course, it doesn't massively increase one's faith when people like David are churning out thoroughly expert PP undergraduates or equivalent who then move smoothly into positions of seniority in government and able to apply these models without necessarily having the deeper understanding that more immersion in institutions would give them. So that's one worry, is about, or, as it were, rationalism as underlying this inflexibility and this contrast between autocracy. The second has to do with a question about democracy itself. One of the things that's interesting about Tocqueville is he comes out with this notion of the aristocratic virtues. So aristocracy is something that's being displaced by democracy, but he's got a tremendous appetite for these aristocratic virtues, these virtues of kind of belief in things that are not about oneself, that are about an affinity with the soil, or of course in some cases an affinity with one's family or with a certain kind of hierarchy. And there's an interesting question as to whether or not one of the approaches, one of the things we should be thinking about now is whether or not democracy isn't a little too self-absorbed and isn't actually thinking enough about what you might call, if not the aristocratic virtues, then the public virtues of honour and duty and things that at least presentationally British politics historically has concerned itself with. And one rather misses that. The notion of virtue has been lost in this rationalistic counterbalance, and it'd be a shame to lose it altogether. So in that context, Burke is quite an interesting supplement to Tocqueville, because he, of course, is deeply suspicious of using the human mind as the measure for all things. And for Burke, what matters is the institutions you're involved in, the social order, the tacit wisdom involved in a society as it evolves. And of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think there's a Tocquevillian, Burkean wisdom that lies there that we could, were we sufficiently devoted, distill from that and reflect on. But let me just wind up with a challenge and a thought. The challenge I want to put to David in a way is to ask a question about this. Is there a worry that the autocracies are starting to do better than we might have thought? After all, the traditional joy about autocracies was that they weren't able to swap power from one set of leaders to another set of leaders. But China's now managing to swap power several times in a rather successful way. If you look at democracy at Western style from an Asian standpoint, from a Chinese standpoint, then of course what they care about above all is stability. That's the supreme virtue from their point of view. And stability, it looks as though what we're getting now is not just an economic challenge or a political challenge, but a deep ideological challenge. That is to say, is it in fact the case that Western democracies can engage with these very long-term problems? Is muddling through an adequate response to a question where the problem is food security or environmental change or some of these things? And is there not a danger that Western democracies will be continuously displaced from that wider goal, as we've seen them displaced in issues, for example, of carbon reduction, by the need to win elections, without ever quite coming back to the track that good governance might see them? Now, of course, the countervailing part of that view would be to say, well, actually they end up muddling through in the right way, and we should trust them to muddling through. So there's a slightly religious way in which people then commit themselves to democracy. And the question is that religious sense, in any sense, underwritten by a deep understanding or by the facts? So that's the first question. Is the intellectual challenge greater now from the autocracies? And it has been. And the second question, I suppose, I want to ask is, how do we better... I mean, if we've muddled in, and the crisis for democracy always arises in muddling out, how do we muddle out better now? Thank you very much.
Now, China, because I think that's absolutely fascinating. We've got an example, as Jesse said, of a regime which can renew itself within its bounds, and which is interesting. I mean, just to take a spuriously topical note, one of your colleagues, one of the education ministers, has now elevated Shanghai maths teachers as to be the model we need to follow, which is in a way which has been inconceivable probably since the 18th century, of looking at the Chinese example. So, China, David.
Okay, I'll say a couple of things about that. I mean, so one is in a sense, drawing on the book, which is we have been here before, right? So one of the years that I talk about in the book is 1962, and there was that thought that the Soviet Union couldn't survive a change of leader. And by the time I get to my part of the story in 1962, the fear is turned on its head, and it's Khrushchev is there, okay, there's Kennedy in the United States, but it looks like all the other democracies have forgotten how to change their leaders, because you've got de Gaulle, and you've got Nehru, and you've got Ben-Gurion, and even in Britain, Harold Macmillan. There's that sense that the gerontocracy is the democracies. So there is, I mean, I only say that to say, I think it's early days in the case of the current Chinese state. I mean, as it were, from Deng Xiaoping to now, we're talking about a human generation. I think the thing about democracies is they show they can do it over a series of generations. So I wouldn't want to sort of prejudge that there is a definition of democracy which if you can have a peaceful change of government twice, that's a real democracy. Well, the Chinese have certainly had a peaceful change of leadership twice. That's not the same as a change of government. I think it would be a little premature, but I do think that the challenge is real. I absolutely agree that the challenge from autocratic, technocratic Chinese capitalism is qualitatively different from, say, the challenge of the Soviet Union, because it's not non-ideological, but it is in a sense post-ideological. And it's a particular kind of technocratic challenge. I mean, the way I tend to see it is that, yes, we're a democracy and they're an autocracy, but we are also increasingly a technocracy and they are increasingly a technocracy. And the fundamental difference is that we are a technocracy of economists and they are a technocracy of engineers. That actually the Chinese Politburo is made up of engineers, people with engineering degrees. Our technocrats are governors of central banks who have got economics PhDs. If that's the battle, I'm not confident that we're going to win. I mean, if it's economists versus engineers, they aren't yet computer engineers, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure the next generation up is, a lot of them training in the United States. And, whether they also have that kind of expertise with the new technology that our technocratic leaders don't have is another question. But there is still that fundamental issue of adaptability. I still think, I'm not sort of blithely optimistic about this, and when it goes wrong for Chinese autocracy, it's going to be terrible for all of us, so there's no reason to be optimistic about any of it. But there is still that fundamental question of how that regime will adapt not to a change of leadership, under relatively peaceful and relatively stable conditions, but a change of leadership under not particularly peaceful and not particularly stable conditions. And there's no historical evidence that there's any system of government that can do that apart from democracies, that can even change leaders in wartime. The First World War, part of the reason that the democracies were panicking is they were changing their leaders, and the Germans were sticking with theirs. Well, thank God we changed ours, and thank God they didn't change theirs, because that's why we won. So on all these things, I'm kind of prepared to be pulled in two different ways. As a battle of technocracies, I'm not confident we're going to win, but there is still, our technocracy is still annexed to democratic adaptability, and that might still, in the long run, be the advantage. How long we've got, I don't know. Because
Jesse?
Well, of course, what makes Burke one of the immortals is that he predicts the disastrous effects of the French Revolution before anyone else does. So the worrying thought is that Burke may suddenly come into his own at the point when China goes up in smoke. And there is obviously a worry that, as David says, as time passes and Chinese growth starts to slow and expectations run ahead, then of course the economic grease that's kept the wheel moving will suddenly run out. At that point, you know, we could potentially hit the buffers, if I can just mix a metaphor badly, quite heavily and quite hard. And at that point, it will be, I don't think we'll be thinking about. I think we'll be in a panic about the fact that these institutions can't renew themselves.
I'm struck by the admiration at respective periods over the century for dictatorial authoritarian regimes. In the 30s, you had it, a whole group in Britain, admiration for the Soviet Union before the show, even after the show trials. In the 60s, well, I think one of the fascinating things, after all, Kennedy got elected partly on a completely false premise of a missile gap, which we now know didn't exist. And even Labour here was saying, oh, well, the Soviet system is going to produce very rapid growth, and our system is failing. It didn't last very long, but at various periods there's been a lot of admiration for authoritarian dictatorial regimes. Even, I mean, obviously in the 30s, when clearly the Western system wasn't working, but in the 50s and 60s, it was interesting. It really only late 60s that the feeling that the Soviet system might outdo us disappeared.
But even through the 70s, the admiration remains. I mean, I think in a sense what's different about it now, and it is striking, that there is this clear, robust, successful alternative to the Western democratic model. But unlike at the previous points in the story I tell, there are very few fellow travellers who are angling for us to adopt it. I mean, we might want to learn some lessons from the Shanghai school system, and even that I think is somewhat half-hearted. But the idea, I tell the story, I don't tell it in the book, but I told it since of an event I did in Cambridge with Seamus Milne, the Guardian journalist, talking about everything that's gone wrong with Western democracy to a well-thinking middle-class audience who were with him every step of the way. It's a disaster, it's chaos, it's crisis, it's unjust, it's unfair, da-da-da. And then someone said, so what's the alternative? And he said, we should run it like the Chinese run theirs. And it was like a Bateman cartoon. The room, he lost the room. And that's different from, so in a sense, it's this non-ideological rival, and maybe the stripping out of the ideology has taken some of its allure away. You don't hear much talk in the Western democracies that they may have advantages over us, the Chinese system, but that we should adopt some of their techniques. And so that does seem to me to be slightly different.
I mean, the paradox is that, as it were, there hasn't been a robust intellectual challenge to liberal capitalist democracy since 1989. And now that there is a fairly robust intellectual challenge, no one's particularly interested to adopt it in this hemisphere. And yet, at the same time, there's all kinds of latent worries that our breakfast is going to be eaten by, you know, a rising Asia over the next half century. So I think there's a deep tension there, which we're going to have to wrestle with over the next few years.
If I could just say one more thing, which is, in a sense, in previous years, there have been two relatively robust challenges. The Chinese challenge, but also the Chavez sort of populist democratic challenge. And that one, I mean, there were...
it's not an intellectual challenge, though, is it? No. People go, that Chavez really onto something. You know?
Well, no, they do. You should
apart from Ken Livingstone and one or two folks in Cambridge and Oxford,
anyway,
they don't, you know.
In a way that might have been comparable to the 1970s.
Yes.
But that is dissolving, in a sense. But I mean, that challenge has proved that it is not sufficiently adaptable. So in a way, already there's a sense that of the two rivals, one is falling away. And that doesn't help to sort of puncture the complacency of the democratic world.
I mean, I think that's right. The gap's been filled by a kind of sub-ideological challenge, which is a kind of green worry, an anti-growth green worry, to which the only response is, well, after a period of extended non-growth, how do you feel? Which it's not very good. So the question is not whether growth or not, but on what terms?
Engagement. We spent the 19th century really up to, I suppose, the until 1928 in the UK. The whole story was one of increasing engagement, increasing number of people who had the right to vote. I mean, 100 years ago, after all, no women and a minority of men. And it happened very rapidly. But now it's disengagement. I mean, is that irreversible? Because it doesn't seem to affect, all right, turnout falls, but compliance with state regulations, people, I mean, we're not like Greece, people pay their taxes reasonably good, despite all the tax avoidance stuff. There isn't widespread evidence of disobedience to the state.
I mean, absolutely. So my crisis of legitimacy that I foresaw in 2005 because no one actually voted for that government, turns out they're still perfectly happy to carry on obeying the laws that it makes and to paying the taxes that fund the projects that it undertakes. So it is, and again, it is different in the sense that for most of this story, there's still a sense that maybe the way to muddle out better is to deepen the democracy, to widen the participation, to widen the engagement. And that story continued right the way through to the start of this century, I think, and the thought that the technology might provide the means to do that. The early, as it now looks, sort of utopianism of e-democracy and the greater participatory opportunities that offered up. And even that seems to have fallen away, that talk is dying back, the idea that somehow the new technology is going to re-engage people, allow them to vote in different ways, create all sorts of sort of plebiscitary opportunities. The technology has become part of the disengagement story. People are on Facebook, they are not doing traditional democratic politics. And how to close that gap, there's not an answer in the last 100 years because the deepening, widening, conventional democracy story, we've sort of run out of road with that. I don't think anyone thinks lowering the voting age from 18 to 16 is going to correct the problem. They'll have a little temporary blip. On one or two questions, like, say, Scottish independence, there seems to be a re-engagement around certain kinds of issues, but the idea that that's going to sustain itself in the long run. So I don't think that the last 100-year story does explain, actually, how to close that gap. And there are reasons for pessimism that the gap is not going to be closed.
Jesse?
It slightly reminds me of that rather apocryphal story of, I think it may have been Macaulay, or someone who doesn't say anything for the first 7 years of life and then suddenly says, no, 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 to his mother. And the mother says, well, darling, you've suddenly started speaking, how wonderful. Why not before now? He says, well, hitherto everything has been perfectly satisfactory.
It sounds like Macaulay.
I just wonder, I mean, in other words, when people are losing trust in politicians, and in politics, it's not absolutely clear to me they're losing trust in the system of which they are part, the freedoms they enjoy, the democratic privileges that are afforded to them. And so that's a slightly different thing. And of course, in a way, grumbling is a safety valve. I mean, well, I'm perfectly happy to grumble, but people aren't going to stop paying their tax as a result. I do think there's one crucial mistake that politicians make in general, which is to think that this disengagement has got to do with things like difficulty in voting. I mean, the reason people don't vote for politicians is because they don't think they're any bloody good. They haven't got anything to vote for. When they get someone they think is worth voting for, in a situation where it really matters that that person gets elected and not that person, they tend to be much more engaged. And
can I just say one more thing, which is that there's also sometimes a thought that we've moved to a different kind of engagement, that it's a mistake simply to think that voter turnout registers these things that around certain issues, especially young people, are very fully engaged. They need to be galvanised by particular campaigns and issues. But again, it strikes me that the problem with that, the idea that you can sort of engage with politics when you need to, is that when you're not engaged with politics, you've left the field to the narrow group of specialists and experts who do it full time. And then when you do need to engage in politics, they run rings around you because they've been doing it all the time that you haven't been doing it. And it is still a way of organising our affairs that requires certain amounts of knowledge and experience and so on.
It's very interesting that in the poll that was done last week, a mass poll, one of the interesting questions was the thing which really got to people was that MPs who hadn't done, quotes, a proper job. That was ahead of whatever school people had been to or anything else. That was the one which was absolutely the major turn-off, which ties in with your point. But I think I agree with you entirely. I think there's a paradox there. Because if you look at the leaders of all the main parties and the top cohorts of the parties, they've all been effectively full-time politicians, well, since, to be generous, 21, and many cases younger than that.
Speak for yourself. I entered politics at the age of 46.
No, but you're an exception. You're an exception, Jesse. But you're an exception because...
I'm not at the top of anybody.
Well, but you know, you look at your leaders, you look at the Chancellor, you look at the Shadow Chancellor, you look at the Leader of the Opposition, look at Nick Clegg, etc., and look at the other member of the Quad, Danny Alexander. They're all professional politicians. They know how to work the system. Yeah. But that actually turns people off. I mean, but there does seem to be a paradox here between those who know how to operate the system, yet the public want more people like you who came in your 40s.
I'd be hesitant to think that the solution to any problem is more people like me, but I do think that I think you're absolutely onto something there, which is this. If you ask, a lot of it depends on framing. If you say to people, what do you think of politicians? They'll say, miserable bunch of thieving, no good layabouts. If you say, what do you think about your local MP? They go, oh, do you know what, Harry's actually okay. You know, it's a classic thing. So the other thing is, if you say to people, what do you think of politics? They go, etc. If you say, are you concerned about, green issues? Absolutely, recycling, pavement, bin collections. I'm just picking things at random, but people get very worked up about issues, and so one of the key things is to create a political discourse which actually speaks to people's concerns in real language they understand, rather than in this fake post-Philip Gould, unfinished revolution, Mandelson, Campbellism that drives everyone completely insane.
Indeed, having heard Peter Mandelson at 7:05 this morning on the Today programme, I had feelings of little nostalgia for the past. Really, all those
you had an allergic reaction as well.
I didn't cut myself shaving, but it came quite near. Right, let's open it up to some points and questions. Alan, I don't know how you classify yourself as an MP turned peer.
Alan Howarth, superannuated MP, member of the House of Lords. The British system of democracy is relatively autocratic. A British Prime Minister, even if he leads a coalition government, has power within our political system which is far greater than the power of an American president. Are we fortunate or unfortunate in that?
It's a good question, and again, that was part of the reason why I thought, can you really give that kind of power, say, to Blair after 2005 on the basis of such a meagre turnout and still think that this is going to be democratically legitimate? Well, it turns out that clearly that this system is sufficiently both adaptable and has the confidence of the public that even that extent of power to someone who has such a meagre vote doesn't challenge its legitimacy. It is part of the adaptability story, and even the American system adapts to more autocratic aspects of its constitution when it needs to, and often it strays to the fringes of its constitution when it needs to, and then it reverts in the way that autocratic regimes, when they adapt in democratic ways, tend to fall apart. But when autocracy or technocracy become entrenched, I mean, that's the challenge here, I think, and it relates to what Peter was saying, that there is a risk that that kind of specialist, narrow career politician group that move seamlessly up and are relatively little exposed to the stresses and strains of robust democratic life with all its pressures to adapt, do become blinkered. And there are features of the British system, including its autocracy, that enhance the risks of being blinkered rather than are evidence of its adaptability. And at the moment, certainly it feels like it's a coalition government, but it does not feel like an especially adaptable government to me. Because the structural features of the system seem to guard against it. And there's a thought here which, again, is a theme in the book, and it's a dangerous thought, which is, for the real adaptability to kick in, the crises have to be worse than the one that we've recently lived through. That actually the adaptability kicked in too soon. It was that technical central banking kind of adaptability of preventing the worst from happening, relative to the crises I talk about in the book, the 30s or even the 70s. It didn't get bad enough to force democratic politicians to think fundamental questions about the structure of the way in which we're governed. But it would be insane to wish for a crisis worse than the one that we've just lived through. And so that's a real bind. The system showed its adaptability by muddling through this crisis in a way that means it's actually become quite entrenched in the way that it behaves. And I think the autocracy of the British state, in that sense, is part of the problem. So on balance, it's that side.
Jesse?
I mean, just to add a couple of things to that. Of course, traditionally, the great genius of the British Constitution was that it concentrated power in this semi-autocratic way, but subject to safeguards of not merely of the vote, but also of constitutional practice. And it was that flexibility that distinguished it. And you would expect me to say this really, but I still think the British Constitution is a work of astonishing evolutionary genius, and I revere it. And I'm very sad when idiotic attempts are made to amend it in a kind of rationalistic way, because actually it amends itself over time rather well. The counterpart of that, though, is that actually systems that are apparently more rational turn out to be in many ways less effective. I mean, the solution to going to anyone who believes in US democracy is to go and see how it's operating at the moment. It's completely governed by the money power. It's an absolute disaster. It's almost impossible to pass legislation. Vast numbers of politicians who are reliant on fundraising, which inevitably compromises them in a way that you'd never get here. I have American friends who come to England and I say, how much do you think can be spent by my campaign or anyone on behalf of my campaign, with my permission or without, in the final month of an election? And the answer is £12,500. And they say, well, hold on a second, that's less than a 15-second slot on state TV. To which the answer is, well, it is. And the joy, therefore, of it is that you have to have your volunteers. And if you don't have volunteers, you're not going to get re-elected, at least not in a contested seat. And the tragedy, in a way, is that often the people that we revere for cutting through these crises, and I absolutely take the point that David makes, I think it's a very, very important point about, as it were, real crisis versus the appearance of crisis, is that a lot of it depends on actually the human skills they have on working that system. I mean, Obama doesn't have those skills, I'm afraid, whereas FDR and the governors in general, Clinton, absolutely do. The idea that Obama can come into a Democrat-controlled House, Democrat Senate, and essentially pass almost nothing of any enormous substance in 6 years is staggering. The final point, just to pick up on the point David makes, absolutely right, that in a way the real worry of the last 5 or 6 years is that we've gone through this absolutely epic crisis, and in their deep heart of hearts, many people don't really believe it. They look at their mortgage costs, and they've actually gone down, and say, well, and then it makes politicians look like even bigger liars than they thought they were before, because they're telling them that they're in a crisis, but it isn't one that the person can actually relate to, and which isn't really, as it were, behaviour changing in a way that something deeper and physically and visibly deeper would be. And I think that stores up all kinds of problems. A classic example, the Eurozone. If the Eurozone, we've burnt the furniture in Europe, and the Europeans have, and thrown it into the fireplace. If the Eurozone now has a crisis, for some other reason, externally imposed shock, Ukraine, anything might be like that, there's nothing in the tank. They're going to be in severe difficulties. So that's why, and one of the reasons is that, that people don't realise how bad it's been unless they've actually specifically lived through it.
Right, gentleman there. Yeah. I'll take a couple now. Yeah.
James Kidner from the Foreign Office. A fascinating discussion, and thank you. But I'm troubled about this muddling through. It doesn't give us a sort of ringing endorsement for the qualities of democracy. It's how do you persuade the man on the Calcutta bus that what he's got is more precious than the man on the Shanghai bullet train? How do we protect democracy against the devices and attractions of the demagogues and autocrats?
Yeah, we'll take there's what Mike Holsworth here, and then I'll.
Michael Holsworth, until recently a civil servant. David, I'm interested in your view of public opinion and its effects, because I got the sense throughout your talk that there's almost a separation between, if you like, things as they are, which may be basically okay, or there may be problems, and then what people think about them, which may be hysteria or maybe, I suppose, broadly accurate. But clearly, I'm guessing you don't think that, because most crises are actually created by the latter, if you like, or indeed many are economic crises. What really has changed apart from what people think about the economy? So I was wondering how you sort of reconcile those two things, and whether you do actually think there's a separation, or whether public opinion really is bound up in as a causal factor.
Right, gentleman here, and I think there's a lady. Right. Yep.
Thank you very much. John Young, Go back 30 years ago, and one recalls, for example, that Pinochet was the dictator of Chile, but you still have minority rule in South Africa, and the Iron Curtain was still up. And who would have imagined that in those countries you now had democracies? And my question really is this: should we now be optimists or pessimists? Because we know of the misbehaviour of the Russians in Ukraine, and also the lack of democracy in China. But I feel that we really should be optimistic. Compared, say, with 30 odd years ago, there's been a huge surge of democracy in Latin America and Africa. I mean, I remember the 60s where there were sort of half a dozen military coups a year.
Right, thank you. Interesting trio there. Foreign Office, the view from the Foreign Office, India versus China, public opinion, and the overall balance. I mean, you know, the indices of how many democracies there are, which everyone does.
Okay, well, I'll just briefly touch on
Indeed,
three
exactly.
here. I mean, the Indian story, and in the book, as I've told the story, it's been, the version I gave was sort of British and Western centric, but in the book I do try and spread it more widely, including to India and other places as well. And one of the things I say in the book is that the Indian story over the last 50 years is quite close to the sort of Tocquevillian story of the early United States. That mixture of actually quite a deep, now entrenched faith in democracy with a lot of surface chaos, really serious rivals. I mean, in the American case, Tocqueville thought, you know, European monarchy was the rival to American democracy. Now Chinese autocracy is the rival to Indian democracy. I'm not an expert on Indian politics by any means, but there have been periods in the last 50 years, and I talk about some of them in the book, where the challenge posed by Chinese, particularly autocracy, to faith in Indian democracy was greater in many respects than it is today, because it is sufficiently stably entrenched. But that would be complacent. I mean, that is the Tocqueville story, right? To think that because 50, 60 years people have got used to it, they've become tolerant of its chaos, means that they won't at some point believe that the alternative is better, would be complacent. But we haven't reached, I don't think we've reached that point yet. And the complicating factor in this is the technological question. I mean, the next 20 years, to see if the great confrontation of the 21st century is going to be India and China, and actually the Western story is going to be increasingly irrelevant, that is going to be mediated through the new technology. And how that plays out, I don't think the 20th century story tells us how to retain faith in democracy in a billion-person networked state. On the public opinion question, yeah, absolutely, it is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And in a way, the story I try and tell is two things are going on with public opinion, and you can see it at the moment, which is it's not just surface hysteria, complaining, grumbling, disengagement. It's also underlying satisfaction, borderline complacency. I mean, people in Britain have not given up on democracy. They hate politics, but if you poll them and ask them, do you still believe in democracy? They still do, and that's true actually in most democracies in the world, including in India. And the evidence is there's very little correlation actually between answers to those kinds of questions and the likelihood of a democracy falling into a real crisis that might threaten a reversion to autocracy. So the two things, and that's sort of the Tocqueville story, the two things exist simultaneously, and they are part of the problem in that there can be a lot of surface change and not much underlying change, and that allows this kind of stumbling in or muddling into these crises. The complacency builds up over time. The story in the run-up to 2008 was unquestionably a story not just of surface complaining, but of a build-up of underlying complacency, people not taking the risks seriously. There was a moral hazard at work. And the moral hazard, which people think is just primarily an economic category, it's a political category too. There is a moral hazard, and this relates to the optimism question, there is a moral hazard to the success of democracy. And I agree, there are lots of reasons to be optimistic, and democracy has spread in ways that wouldn't have seemed possible even 30 years ago, and to parts of the world where it seemed incredibly unlikely. But the story for the established democracies in the last 10 to 15 years is not good. I mean, there may be a mismatch here in that in the developing world, the story for democracy is much more positive, but in the Old West, America being the classic case, it's a much less positive story. But there is a risk to optimism, and there is always a risk. I'm not saying we should all be pessimists, but the risk to optimism is precisely the view that what we are is on Tocqueville's historic wave, which is, as Tocqueville said, democracy is God's providential plan for the universe, and we need to adapt. Well, that belief, that religious faith, it has its downside, which is you do become blind to the risks that you face. I'm torn. I'm not a straight-out pessimist, but I think there are grounds from what is a broadly optimistic story for thinking that the optimism is itself part of the problem.
Jesse, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, of course,
A realist.
yes, no, hope springs eternal. Yeah, no, I am I'm a dyed-in-the-wool optimist of the worst kind. I'm a complete Pollyanna. And so I have to say to people around, for goodness sake, don't pay any attention to what I think. What's the answer? Because I tend to be far too optimistic about it. And actually, I think that's, for reasons that David described, broadly justified. If you look at the state of the world now, unless we're being miserabilists about it, and I got hammered by Will Self and Rod Little the other day in a debate on this, the truth is has there actually been a time where, if you could do that Rawlsian test of not knowing in advance where you were going to be in society, you would rather have lived? In other words, you can't say where you would be in society. Would you rather live during the Tudor times? Well, answer, if you were Henry VIII, sure. If you were in that juicy TV series, absolutely. But otherwise, probably not. And now, the bottom billion is being lifted up by technology and markets in a way that no one could have anticipated. And all these, longevity is exploding. Healthcare is, wildly improving. I mean, it's a wonderful story. On the other hand, as David said, you have to have a sense of nervousness with it, and you have to carry that sense of nervousness at the point. Someone has got to take away the punch bowl, and ideally, government builds within it mechanisms that do that for it. I would say one thing about that, which is another point, just quickly on this, is that, of course, we always tell ourselves stories that have the effect of ratifying our activity. Of course, it turns out that, if you were in 2007, it wasn't that you were being optimistic. All you were doing was recognizing that the efficient market hypothesis and the proliferation of finance had fundamentally changed the nature of economics, and therefore that growth was limitlessly possible as financed by these newly invigorated capital markets. Turns out that was balls. But that was the story we were telling ourselves at the time, using these officially ratified experts that duly came up with something that we found terribly convenient. I of course, think muddling through is not only the only way we can manage, but I think it's actually in a bizarre way rational. And so I'm not as anti that as you might think. How do we make it exciting to people who might be lured by demagogues? You answer by the way we present it, and by having a historical dimension in our minds and a sense of the romance and the joy, and also, frankly, by just reminding people of the joy of a life lived in perpetuations of freedom, ordered freedom. The ability to float down a river without worrying whether or not it's been infected with a pesticide that's been extruded by the chemical company up the road. Not many rivers in China, at least in eastern China, where you can do that. The chance to express yourself vigorously with someone who hates your guts without thinking they're going to come for you in the middle of the night. Those are the things we need to talk about.
And also the chance to say, we're in crisis, the sky's falling in, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
Hell!
That's right. Like in Asterix, who is that splendid character who always thinks the sky's falling?
But if I just say one thing about that, because I think that the muddling through story, I think it is the story, and it's broadly a success story. But what the pattern shows is that each time we muddle through, and Jesse said it's sort of rational, but we also rationalise it. I mean, that's the other side of it, is that we tell ourselves a story, as you said, which is it wasn't muddling through, actually...
Are the mishaps getting worse, David? That's what I want. In other words, if we're muddling through, are we doing this where we just lack the capacity to rebound because the scale of the problem...
I mean, that's one of the risks.
So let's tell a quick story. We trod along as we are for 2 or 3 years. It turns out the shadow banking sector just explodes, and then we're absolutely toast. That seems to me a highly possible economic scenario. But do you see anything in the historical pattern that suggests that these
I've said this is
bigger?
cyclical as though this was some grand sweeping history. It's only 100 years. Yeah. I only tell 7 stories in the book. They're actually completely dissimilar. It's not 10 to 15-year cycles. There isn't really... so the idea that we could draw comfort from that, it could be that it is completely different now.
I think we now need the Runciman cycle, like the Kondratiev cycle.
But the other thing that is clearly changing is literally the nature of political time. I mean, it's like the idea that these patterns just map onto something that is reliable and cyclical. The environmental story works to a different cyclical pattern than anything in this book, and the technology story works to a different pattern than anything in this book. Moore's law every 18 months, doubling of capacity. That does not fit this story. In 15 years' time, and many people believe this, 2030 is the singularity. That's when man and machine mesh. Well, I've got nothing to say about that.
No. One final thing to you both, starting with you, Jesse. If Russell Brand was here, what's your reply to him?
Me?
Yeah. What's your reply to him? If you had Russell Brand here doing his disengagement, anti-politics, you're all rubbish, don't vote, thing. You must get that in your constituency.
I think the position is so fatuous that it falls on its face. So I wouldn't say anything to him. I just allow him to convict himself.
Whereas I, who talk to real live students, know that it's a serious position that has to be tackled head on, because a lot of people think it's very persuasive. And I think that the argument is, it's in a way, it's that technocratic one. You don't want to assume that the threshold beneath which this system will just fall apart is anywhere near in sight. And if you withdraw, if you stop voting, if you say to the politicians, we're having nothing to do with you, you are not pulling the rug out from under them. You're leaving the field free to them to do whatever they want. And I think that argument, I mean, it can be made. It's again that sort of, how bad do you want it to get before the thing that you want to affect change kicks in? And you have to think about quite how bad it would have to get before this system loses its legitimacy. And it's a long way off, and young people withdrawing from politics is not going to trigger it. What it will do is trigger, and this is the thing that's the easiest thing to say to students, it will trigger what is carrying on at the moment, which is that older people are the ones that the politicians will listen to. The reason you're paying your fees and their pensions are protected is because you don't vote. And if you want to really take the risk of going right the way down that route, it's going to have to get a lot worse before the thing you want to happen kicks in.
Can I add a tiny note to that? Of course, that is an absolutely slam dunk rebuttal of the point I made, and I absolutely agree with you. And there's another reason why. There's another reason why it's right, which is that I mean, if you think about politics is a public deliberation about the conditions under which we should be governed, and therefore it can't just be about action; it has to be about principles. And the moment where debate stops is the moment where we've essentially committed suicide. So we have to maintain the argument and meet the argument, even if we distrust or somehow despise whoever's on the other side of the argument.
I'm afraid I'm going to call time. I don't want to. It's been a real treat. It's been absolutely illuminating, stimulating. David, I'm delighted we've been able to provide a forum for you to discuss the ideas in your book, also the ideas since you wrote the book, particularly on technology, which I think takes it forward very much indeed. And Jesse, thank you very much for being a respondent on that, and the ideas you both had in the discussion we've had over the last 25 minutes. I can just see from everyone's faces how stimulated they've been by this. This is part of a series we call Big Thinkers. We had Roberta Unger back in November. We're carrying through. We had Linda Colley talking in January on her book on union disunion. We hope to have Francis Fukuyama here in September. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Hewlett Packard, who supported us in this series. We're very grateful to them for their commitment to a series which I think extends the Institute's range of activity. And so to HP, thanks very much indeed, because I personally enjoy these sessions enormously. The big attendance shows that IFG supporters and friends also enjoy it, because it broadens the range of debate about the nature of government, which I think is absolutely central, even though sometimes we also feel our motto here for everything is muddling through. Could you join me in thanking David and Jesse?